Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. My name is Enrique Desmond Arias. I am the director of the Bildner Center for Western Hemisphere Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. We are privileged to have with us here today Nicholas Barnes, who is a lecturer or assistant professor, I think is what the title would be in the United States, in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews and affiliated faculty at the Center of Peace and Conflict Studies and the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at that university. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He has conducted multiple years of fieldwork in Rio de Janeiro's favelas and is currently working on a book project about how and why gangs govern these communities. His academic work has been published in Comparative Political Studies, Perspectives on Politics, Current Sociology, which was co-authored with me, Latin American Research Review, Civil Wars, and the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Criminology and Criminal Justice. He's also the editor of a really cool book of photography in shantytowns in Rio de Janeiro, which is not mentioned in our bio here. So without further ado, I give the floor to Nicholas Barnes for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Desmond. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's actually quite fitting that this is this presentation I'm about to give is about my current book project that I'm just finishing up. And it's the culmination of about 15 years of work that started maybe after I read Desmond's first book when I was a graduate student. So it's particularly momentous, I think, to be here with Desmond. So I'll talk for 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes, give you a sense of the the argument that I'm developing about how and why gangs are governing communities in one particular set of communities, but I think the argument travels. And then I hope to have a conversation interested in any questions that people may have. So I'd like to start with this photograph that I think pretty accurately captures how most people think about Rio's gangs. These are coercive organizations that threaten marginalized populations to maintain their access to illicit economies. But not every gang looks exactly like this. Some gangs look more like this. This is a baile funk. This is a massive street party that a gang threw in a favela in Rio de Janeiro, where they have a fireworks show. They hire a very popular DJ. All of this is free of charge to local youth. This is an important type of benefit that gangs can provide to local communities. This is perhaps only the most visible form of benefit that gangs provide. Many gangs also distribute welfare in the community, especially to the poorest residents. This is a cesta básica. This is a monthly food basket that some gangs will distribute to dozens, if not hundreds of families within the communities. This has enough food for a family of 5 to eat for a month, rice, beans, oil, a variety of dry goods. Gangs don't only distribute welfare and throw parties, they also resolve disputes and implement variously responsive forms of social order within these neighborhoods. So this is a sign that was written in one of the neighborhoods that I did research in, and it says it's prohibited to throw trash in the alleys and the slopes by order of the directorship, and then you have the gang tag there at the bottom. This is not because the gang is inherently interested in the environment or curbing pollution. This is because residents had asked the gang if they could make sure that people weren't throwing trash where their kids play. And so some gangs are very responsive to local community demands for this sort of thing. So these various activities that gangs are engaging in brings up a series of questions that I try to answer in the book. And the biggest one is, why do they do any of this? These are seemingly clandestine organizations that are interested more in making money off of the drug trade than they are in solving people's problems, distributing welfare. Why would they do any of this? And then why are some gangs more coercive? Why do they feel the need to threaten local communities so much? Whereas other gangs maybe are more beneficial. They're providing a lot of stuff to the community. Why do we find this variation? This is not to suggest that gangs are either coercive or benevolent. In fact, gangs can be both coercive and benevolent at the same time, or they can be neither benevolent nor very coercive. And so the book tries to explain all of this variation that we see in the types of relationships that emerge between gangs and local communities. This is a particularly important, these are particularly important set of questions in Latin America, where according to the recent LAPOP survey, they found that about 79 million people report living under some form of criminal authority. These could be transnational gangs in Central America, drug cartels in Mexico, a variety of different groups in Venezuela and Colombia, or a variety of different groups in Brazil as well. These are most often the most marginalized and impoverished citizens within each of these states. And so trying to think about the type of environment in which they live, how they navigate these relationships, how they, in some cases, may even support these groups, is an important set of questions for us to understand the politics of the region more generally. Now, there are several existing explanations that we have from work being done or having been done on Rio de Janeiro. The first is comes from Elizabeth Leeds from the 1990s, and she argues that basically it's the gang leader that decides what the relationship with the community is going to be like. Sometimes you get good gang leaders and other times you get bad gang leaders, and that's going to account for these types of behaviors and these types of relationships. Actually, Desmond, in his first book and several other works, has developed an alternative explanation for why we find variation in governance, and that is the groups that have more stable, illicit connections with the state can provide more and better goods to the local communities. And then finally, Luke Dowdney has argued that it's much more about the profitability of the drug trade. Gangs that make a lot of money because their community is maybe located in a very desirable place for the drug trade, have access to more resources and can distribute more benefits to the local community, or can buy more weapons. And this is really what dictates why we see this variation in governance. In the book project that I'm working on, I develop an alternative explanation for why we see gangs govern and how they govern. And it has more to do with the local security environment in which they find themselves. Gangs don't want to govern, but they have to govern if they're going to gain the support, the explicit and sometimes tacit support of the local community, because they almost all of them exist within very volatile security environments. And so there's really two different dynamics that I'm going to pay attention to in the talk, and that is their relationship with rivals is an existential threat to them. If a rival comes into their territory, it's almost always to take over that territory and to kick that gang out. In response to this type of threat, they respond coercively. And that includes using threats and violence against local residents. They have to use all of the means at their disposal to stick around and make sure that people are very afraid of them. The dynamic with police is very different, however. The police don't present an existential threat to gangs. Virtually the world over, no matter how much the police try to repress these organizations, try to enforce against them, they're never going to move into the community, stick around, and totally eradicate these organizations. It's virtually unheard of. But they are going to enforce against them. And the gang, in response to this, trying to avoid enforcement, needs the help of local residents to try to avoid that enforcement. So they respond by giving more benefits. I'm going to describe a little bit more about how I developed this argument later on, but I'll give a short outline of the talk. First, I'm going to talk about the fieldwork that I engaged in and some of the methods I used to study this topic. I'll elaborate a little bit more about this governance puzzle. And then I'll read actually a couple of short sections from the book that I think give a good sense of how and why gangs are responding in these ways. And then finally, I'll conclude with a couple of implications. So the fieldwork. Rio de Janeiro is a city of 6 million people, 12 million in the larger metropolitan area in the southeast of Brazil. And within the city, there's over 1,100 favelas. These are informal and impoverished neighborhoods. And in the vast majority of them, you have some type of criminalized or criminal group that's present, that's governing daily life in these neighborhoods. I moved to Rio in 2012, interested in this topic of governance within these communities, and found very quickly that this is not such an easy topic to study. I spent the first 6 months, apologies, traveling around to as many of these different neighborhoods as I possibly could. I got in contact with local researchers, NGOs, anyone who I knew who could bring me into these neighborhoods. These are not the types of neighborhoods that you can just walk in. You have to already know people in order to do so. So I spent 6 months traveling around to about 60 of these neighborhoods. And over that time, I learned a lot about governance in these neighborhoods and how different gangs, different groups were governing them. But I always felt like some of the information I was getting was relatively superficial. There's a very popular saying in Rio de Janeiro, para inglés ver, or for the English to see. And this is how people think about telling people from the outside, a white gringo at that, what is actually going on in the neighborhood. So I always felt like people were giving me sort of canned responses. And so I decided that I wanted a deeper, more intimate understanding, and I felt like it was very important to place myself within the community to understand how governance functions within it. So over the course of those first 6 months, I identified a set of neighborhoods called Complexo da Maré in the northern zone of the city up here that I've highlighted. And I eventually decided to move there. Maré is a good place to study governance because you have a bunch of different groups that are present. Maré is actually a set of 16 separate but contiguous neighborhoods with 140,000 people living in them in just over 1 square mile. So just to give you a sense of the density of that population, it's more dense than where we are right now, more dense than Manhattan. So they're very tightly packed communities. And there you have 4 different organizations that govern these neighborhoods. You have a militia or a police-connected mafia that runs protection rackets up here in the north, in the blue. And then you have 3 drug trafficking gangs that control different areas within the rest of Maré. You have 2 that are connected to Comando Vermelho, the Red Command. This is the oldest and the largest of the drug trafficking prison-based factions in the city. And then you have another gang at the bottom in the green here, connected to another faction in the prisons called Terceiro Comando, or Third Pure Command. So I moved into one of these neighborhoods, Nova Holanda here, in June of 2013. And for the next 18 months, I lived there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I tried to live as much as I could like any other resident, despite the fact that I was a 6'2" gringo. So there were certain ways that I was quite different from the people who lived there, but I shopped at local supermarkets. I used informal transportation. I tried as much as I could to live like residents in Maré. And over the next 18 months, I engaged in a bunch of different types of methods to collect data on these questions. I collected participant observation of gang governance. It's happening all around you in these neighborhoods, on the streets often. I conducted over 200 semi-structured interviews, about a third of which were with current and former gang members, a third of which were with community leaders, and then a third were with a cross-section of residents. I collected a database of over 500 newspaper articles that dealt with some aspect of criminal governance from the 1950s to the present. And then with some colleagues, we engaged in a survey of residents, as well as we collected gang denunciations, anonymous denunciations to a very popular hotline in Rio de Janeiro. In this talk, I'm going to focus more on the qualitative forms of data, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end about the others. So this governance puzzle. I find governance to be a particularly useful framework for understanding the relationships that emerge between gangs and local neighborhoods, because it's a two-way street. Gangs do not dominate and unilaterally decide much of their behavior. It's always in conversation with the people who live in those neighborhoods. And this this concept of governance very much gets at that give and take, what gangs really need from residents as well as what they are providing. So far, much of the literature has described this as criminal governance, but I think a better way to think about it is criminalized governance, because there are no inherently criminal organizations. There are ones that are sort of socially and politically constructed in that way. The state decides what is considered to be criminal and criminalizes certain populations much more than others. And so this criminalization is I think important to note in our conceptual apparatus. But I define it, criminalized governance, as the structures and practices through which criminalized groups control territory and manage relations with local populations. And I talk about two different dimensions of governance. One is coercion, the use of violence and threats to control that territory and manage those relations, and then the types of benefits they provide, the carrots and the sticks, so to speak, behind how they're trying to relate to local populations. And we can separate these into a bunch of different activities that the gangs are engaged in. So it could be about their physical presence in terms of coercion, how much they're on the streets, where they locate themselves, how much they're carrying around weapons within these neighborhoods. It could have to do with the types of punishments, the threats, the expulsions, in certain cases, the torture, beatings, and executions that they will engage in. And then it's also about surveillance. They're monitoring all the time what's going on in these neighborhoods. But these activities vary quite a bit. Some gangs are much more coercive in their behavior. They're using executions frequently. They're using threats much more frequently. They're very closely surveilling, monitoring the local community. Other gangs are taking a much more hands-off approach. So we find significant variation on this dimension. Similarly, with benefits, some gangs are resolving any and all forms of disputes that residents might bring to them. This could be problems with a neighbor, domestic violence, sexual violence of any kind. This could have to do with local businesses, hiring practices. Some gangs are very responsive to these types of demands or requests for dispute resolution. There's also economic stimulation that these groups will engage in. As I mentioned at the beginning, they can distribute welfare in certain cases. They'll provide food baskets, buy medicine, provide transportation, whereas some gangs don't do very much of that, if at all. And then finally, they provide recreation. They provide parties, not just the baile funks, but they'll provide holiday parties for Children's Day, Mother and Father's Day, Easter, Christmas. They have big raffles. Some gangs do a lot of that. Other gangs don't do very much. So we find this significant variation, and I've broken it down into the obligatory 2x2. So I would argue that a gang that doesn't use very much coercion against the local neighborhood, they don't use very much threats or violence, but are very responsive to some of these demands for benefits, is what we might call a social bandit gang. A gang that uses a lot of violence, but also provides a lot of benefits, we can think of as a benevolent dictator gang. A laissez-faire gang, on the other hand, doesn't respond very much to any demands, doesn't provide very much in terms of benefits to the local community, and they don't use very much violence. They're letting people sort of live their lives within these neighborhoods. And then finally, the tyrant gang is perhaps the worst type of gang that you would want in your own neighborhood. This is one that uses a lot of violence, but doesn't provide very much in terms of benefits to local residents. So now I want to read a couple of different sections that I think give you a good sense of how and why gangs are moving, or you find them in these different quadrants that I've described. So by mid-October 2013, I had been living in Nova Zelanda for nearly 4 months. On another otherwise ordinary Wednesday, I had arranged to speak with the director of the Lona Cultural, an NGO located in the heart of Mare. The Lona sits on the border between the territory controlled by the Comando Vermelho of Nova Zelanda gang, where I lived, and the adjacent set of neighborhoods controlled by a gang connected to the Terceiro Comando Puro faction. Over the course of my first few months in Mare, I had already visited the Lona several times. It was only a 5-minute walk from my apartment. So just before noon, I turned onto Main Street and headed in the direction of the Divisa, or the border, as the residents refer to it. Like nearly every other day, the traffic was heavy. Cars and trucks squeezed past one another as young men and boys, many of whom were affiliated with the local gang, zigzagged in and out of the traffic on their motorbikes. On my way, I passed two bocas de fumo, where I could see the drug trade operating in the midday heat. Boca de fumo means mouth of smoke. At the first, a handful of well-armed gang members sat next to two tables they had placed in the shade. Several customers perused a dozen or so plastic bags of different quantities of crack, cocaine, and marijuana that were haphazardly arranged on the table. The second boca, closer to the divisa, was much less busy, likely because of its proximity to the border. It sat at the end of a large plaza, which opened onto the entrances to two different schools, both situated just on the Nova Yolanda side of the border. This boca, however, served as more than a source of drug revenue. Its location offered an excellent vantage of the border area. On this day, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Two adolescents sat lazily around a plastic blue table with only a couple of sacks of drugs on it. Their semi-automatic rifles leaned against the nearest brick wall. They did not even look up as I passed. The actual border between the two gangs is constituted by a single narrow street, Avenida Alves. Residents often refer to this street and the surrounding area as the Faixa de Gaza, or the Gaza Strip, because of the significant violence that has taken place there over the years. I had heard numerous stories of the gang shootouts and invasions along this border, but since I had moved to Mare, there had been no such inter-gang violence. In fact, according to residents and gang members, there had been no serious shootouts or invasion attempts for at least the last year. The two gangs were in a period of détente, though each continued to monitor the border and maintain a presence there. For their part, residents could cross over the border with little concern for their safety. I myself had crossed the border dozens of times since moving to Mare. In fact, most days I ate lunch in the home of an older couple and spent many evenings at a bar which featured live shows by local bands, both of which were in the TCP territory. In all of those crossings, I had never felt gang members on either side paying particularly close attention to me. This day was no different. The Lona is comprised of three main buildings: an auditorium, a small library, and a kitchen and office, all surrounded by a 10-foot brick wall. I walked through the open double doors and was immediately greeted by several children that regularly hung around the NGO. The director welcomed me, and we made our way to his office in the back of the compound. After our interview, I stuck around to chat with two of the staff, Clara and Breno, with whom I had become acquainted on my previous visits. As the three of us were talking at the threshold of the entrance, 3 gunshots rang out. We instinctively ducked our heads and stepped back from the doorway. Frozen, we waited for what came next. A couple of moments passed before a return volley from the other side of the border. From there, the shootout escalated. Multiple shots came from all around us. Breno and I quickly closed and locked the double doors, and the three of us rushed to the back of the compound. From there, the shootout escalated. Multiple shots came from all around us. On our way to the back of the compound, we looked for the children, but thankfully they had gone home for lunch. We rushed into the director's office, effectively putting several brick and concrete walls between us and the bullets. It seemed as good a place as any to hide and wait. We laid down on the floor and listened to the shootout unfold. Dozens of shots came from every direction. Some could be heard further off in the distance, others right outside the Lona's walls. I don't know whether it was the cool tile floor or the adrenaline coursing through my body, but I vividly recall the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end and shivers running down my spine. For several years, I had read and heard numerous accounts of the incredible violence between Rio's gangs, but had never experienced it up close. I was stunned by how long the shootout stretched. It was a full 30 minutes of constant shooting before we heard an explosion. All of the windows in the office shook. I didn't understand what had happened. I looked to my companions. Breno, who had grown up in Mare and was now in his early 30s, howled, "Oh fuck, that was a grenade." I knew that many of Rio's gangs had access to such weapons, but their use still came as a shock. Another grenade exploded several seconds later, shaking the windows again. More gunfire. Then a string of grenades, 4 or 5 in quick succession, that reverberated through the building and in my chest. Clara took out her computer, opened Facebook, and began writing messages to her friends and family about where she was and what was happening. It was another 30 minutes of unbroken gunfire before the shots eventually became more sporadic, then ceased entirely. Later, in interviews with gang members, I learned that the shootout was the result of an invasion attempt by TCP. Several dozen heavily armed TCP members had tried to cross into their rivals' territory at strategic points. The Comando Vermelho members had detected the invasion immediately and successfully repelled it. TCP did not end up getting very far that day, and the shootout had mostly occurred along the border. We waited an hour after the last gunshot before emerging from our hiding place. We opened the main doors, peeked out, and cautiously exited the building. There was a strange smell in the air. The exterior wall of the Lona was riddled with bullets. And the school is just across the border as well. These are photographs of all those bullet holes. It was difficult to tell which ones were new and which had been there for some time. I looked around for larger signs of damage, but couldn't see exactly where the grenades had gone off or which side had used them. They were likely stun grenades used to disorient and incapacitate an enemy with a loud burst and a flash of light. My only thought at the time was to get away from the border. Breno and I lived in the Comando Vermelho territory and Clara in Terceira Commando's territory. We said our goodbyes and headed in opposite directions. Breno and I turned down Main Street, moving quickly but not running because we did not want to draw attention of any lingering gang members. The last boca that I had passed on my way was now empty. The 2 gang members and the sacks of drugs were gone. The plastic table and chairs had been cast aside and were laying in a heap. I spotted hundreds of shell casings on the ground. Nova Holanda was a ghost town. There were no cars, trucks, or motorcycles on the roads. The carts and stalls that lined the streets were empty, and all of the shops were closed, their metal gates pulled down and locked. I noticed several residents peeking out from doorways or from windows, appraising the situation, wondering if it was safe to move around. There were likely hundreds of residents still waiting at bus stops, restaurants, and snack stands along Avenida Brazil until they were sure it was safe to return to their homes. I said goodbye to Breno, turned the corner to my street, and suddenly felt very tired. I climbed the 4 flights to my apartment and immediately threw myself on the bed. Before I fell asleep, I remember hearing the dull thumping of a police helicopter somewhere in the distance. Over the ensuing weeks, the tensions between the gangs remained high, and I noticed that the behavior of the local gang in the neighborhood that I lived in changed pretty dramatically. The border, instead of just having a couple of gang members watching it, became much more militarized. They had 24-hour surveillance. Different groups were walking along the border, maintaining their security. They started increasing their monitoring of local residents. So if anyone tried to cross over, they would usually stop and question them to make sure that they weren't working with their rival. They also started displaying their weapons more ostentatiously. They would sometimes carry around multiple semi-automatic weapons, drive their motorcycles up and down the streets much more frequently. And they accepted more than 100 foreign reinforcements. So many of these gangs are connected through these networks, and the gang leader in this neighborhood had allowed more than 100 foreign gang members to come into his own neighborhood, and they behaved much more coercively towards the local residents. So from these ethnographic insights, I started to develop a theory that gangs have to defend their territory in this way. If a rival tries to come across that border, the Comando Vermelho gang is always going to respond in this way. They've been responding this way for the last several decades. They fear infiltration of their territory and that residents may be collaborating with their enemies, so they increase the use of coercion against local residents. They want to remind everyone that they are in a dominant position within the community. And so they're doing this consistently. This type of behavior, this more coercive response to this feeling of existential threat, if a gang from outside comes into their territory, manages to take it over, they all will be expelled from the territory. That gang will go around the entire community, expel all of their family, all of their friends. So in order for them to stick around in those neighborhoods, they have to defend their territory at all costs. This is the reason that they respond so coercively when they face a rival in this way. It's very different with the police, and I'm going to read another short section here. By the time I moved to Mare in June of 2013, Nova Zelanda and the rest of Mare had been subject to several years of frequent militarized police operations. In fact, in August of 2011, the Batalhão de Operações Policiais Especiais, or BOPI, an elite counter-gang unit akin to SWAT in the United States, had moved their headquarters to a defunct military base on the edge of Mare. You can see it here in the purple at the top. The two CV-controlled areas of Mare were a particular focus of BOPI because combating and weakening the Comando Vermelho faction, the strongest and largest of the gang factions, was at the core of the city's once heralded police pacification units, or UPPs. Begun in 2008, the UPPs were a public security initiative designed to break the paradigm of territories that are controlled by traffickers with weapons of war, according to then Public Security Secretary Mariano Beltrame. Eventually, in April of 2014, Mare would be occupied by the Brazilian military, the last of Rio's favelas to be pacified. Until then, BOPI operations were a regular part of life. According to my field notes, I witnessed a BOPI operation at least once a week over this period. Most lasted just an hour or two and involved little or no violence. BOPI invaded Nova Zelanda in one of two ways. Either directly from the 22nd Military Police Battalion, this is a police station, although it looks more like a military installation in Nova Zelanda, or from one of the several streets along Avenida Brasil, one of the major highways in Rio that borders Mare. When BOPI operations began, gang lookouts stationed at all of the entrances to CVNH's territory would shoot off firecrackers to signal an impending police operation. Upon hearing the firecrackers, gang members and residents alike would quickly find places to hide. Nova Zelanda's streets, normally bustling with activity, would become almost entirely vacant for the duration of these operations. BOPI operations always involved one or more enormous armored trucks called caveirões, or big skulls, literally, designed to withstand gunfire from assault rifles as well as high-powered explosives. These vehicles often include a 360-degree gun turret, multiple firing ports, and can transport as many as a dozen police in and out of favelas. Joining the caveirões were helicopters that flew low over the community to prevent gang members from using the rooftops as escape routes or as locations from which to fire on the police below. This is a photograph from my apartment window. The sight and sound of the caveirões diesel engines rumbling on the streets below, combined with the deafening sound of helicopters overhead, created the sensation of being under siege. On the streets of Nova Zelanda, the caveirões were restricted to the main thoroughfares because the neighborhood's numerous alleys and side streets are not wide enough for the massive vehicles to maneuver. BOPI police would often exit their vehicles to pursue gang members or carry out searches in these areas. BOPI typically wear all black tactical uniforms and balaclava to cover their faces. Many of them do not even have their names or badges showing on their uniforms. One of the only visible markers of BOPI police is their insignia, faca na caveira. You can see it there in the photograph, knife in the skull, embroidered on their sleeves and emblazoned on the sides of all of their vehicles. BOPI police are well trained in counterinsurgency tactics. Their movements are highly coordinated, and they seldom make much noise as they move through the streets on foot. BOPI operations would occasionally yield tangible results, the seizure of drugs or weapons or the arrest or death of a gang member, but most occurred without incident and were short-lived. Even if the local gang members had wanted to confront BOPI, they were little match for the elite police unit. Despite their significant armaments, gang members are largely untrained, and the gang had no defense against the caveirões. Gang members also understood that confrontations with BOPI would only increase the severity of operations and the likelihood of enforcement against them. According to Inácio, one of the gang's managers, BOPI doesn't scare us, he said, but we don't want confrontations. That's the gang leader's call. He doesn't want confrontations with them when they come in because it'll only make things worse. Moreover, gang members knew that BOPI was never going to take over their territory permanently and that their presence would always be brief. Therefore, instead of running to defend their territory like they would for a rival, the gang melted into the population. Gang members quickly found places to hide, often in the homes and businesses, apologies, of family, friends, or other residents, and waited for the operations to conclude. The gang placed several steel I-beams in deep holes at the entrances to the neighborhood, which forced Bopi police to exit their vehicles, remove them, giving the gang members valuable seconds to find sufficient hiding places. During operations, residents and gang members stayed off the streets entirely, but within minutes of the operation concluding, gang members would re-emerge and resume their activities. Despite not being an existential threat to the gang, as would a rival, if members were to avoid arrest and possibly death at the hands of the police and limit the confiscation of guns and drugs, they required the help of residents. In interviews with current and former members, they described how they had sometimes needed residents to hide them, to warn them of police in the vicinity, to use their house to escape, or to give them different clothes, often a school or work uniform, so they could disguise themselves. According to Francisco, a longtime gang member, he said, "We bought things for them so they would help us. We bought gas or medicine or food, and they would hide us or give us clothes." Beyond spontaneous forms of support, gang members also wanted residents not to denounce them to the authorities. They threw more parties, offered more welfare, involved themselves deeply in the personal lives of local residents, resolved any and all disputes that people brought to them. They needed the community because Bopi was constantly engaging in this type of enforcement against them. So from these sort of ethnographic insights, I also develop a theory about police enforcement and its effect on the governance activities of the gang. So gangs seek to avoid detection, arrest, and confiscation. They need the residents at least not to denounce them, if not to help them when the police come into these neighborhoods. And the gang becomes, as a result, more responsive to the community's demands for benefits. So from these ethnographic insights, I develop a theory that accounts for why gangs are governing in these distinct ways. When the activation of a threat with a rival, a war begins between two gangs, I call this disorder. The gang will engage in extreme and brutal types of punishments against local residents. Often, these are the worst types of torture that you could imagine. Public executions for anyone who they think is not loyal to them. They're engaging in very little benefits in these moments of warfare with a rival. These moments, the one that I described to you, just happened one afternoon, and then that war didn't escalate or continue very much. But some of these wars can last for weeks, months. In certain cases in Mare, these wars have lasted for years of constant invasions between two gangs that disrupt local life and the local economy incredibly. When these groups are not at war, but the possibility of warfare, the activation of the threat is high, I call this latent. And a group that is also experiencing active enforcement by the police will engage in more of a benevolent dictator type of attitude. They need the support of the residents to avoid the police, but the possibility that a rival might come in is high. So they want to always be mindful that they are surveilling, monitoring residents, making sure that people know that they're in a dominant position within the neighborhood. A social bandit gang faces no threat, rival threat, but active police enforcement. They don't need to remind people that they're in control because they face no rival, but they want the support of the community to avoid enforcement. The laissez-faire gang, as I described earlier, experiences absent rival threat and absent police enforcement. This does occasionally occur, although it's probably the least common. Police are often trying to enforce against gangs. But there are some gangs that are maybe too far outside of the city or have developed collaborative relationships with the police, which also happens in Rio, and they avoid police enforcement almost entirely in this way. Finally, the tyrant is going to engage in high coercion, unresponsive benefits as a result of facing a possible threat from a rival, but very low levels of police enforcement. So I just described to you basically the first half of the book. In the second half, I'm going to conclude here in a few minutes. I trace not just this Nova Holanda gang and the period that I lived there, but I go back in time all the way from when they integrated, a local gang integrated into the faction in the 1990s. And I trace over that time the relationship with local residents, the gang's activities through interviews, oral histories, and some of this archival work that I engaged in. And so the local gang integrated in 1994. Eventually, they would fight an all-out war for about 5 years at the beginning of the 2000s, when most of the gangs in the city were engaging in warfare between the factions. And then it shifts radically over time. I also trace the other gangs. So we have another gang that's in a very different type of security environment, despite being part of the same faction. This gang has never experienced any warfare in its entire history. It has a buffer by its neighbor, and there are no gangs no rival gangs in its vicinity. So they've had basically a latent threat for a couple of years when all-out war was going on between the factions in the city, but has basically never felt the need to coerce the residents in the same way that their partner gang in Nova Holanda has. Finally, the Terceiro Comando case is a little bit more complicated because it gains and loses a lot of territory over time. So initially in the 1990s, it fought a war from 1992 to 1996 for control of the neighborhoods in the South, and eventually conquers all of them and then has no rivals for a few years. But in 2002, the gang breaks in two. There's a schism at the highest levels of the city and the factions, and a new faction is created actually in Maré called Terceiro Comando Puro. Previously, it was called Terceiro Comando, but they had formed an alliance with Friends of Friends, which is another faction, and that broke down. And so they added pure to the end of their name to say that we're not forming any more friendships with any of the other factions. And these two gangs fought a war for several years. And then in 2009, this gang invaded and was able to capture all of that territory. So we see a huge variation just within one set of neighborhoods in terms of the types of relationships that develop, the type of security environments that these gangs exist in, that is shaping how they're relating to local communities. I'm going to conclude here in 2 minutes. So I think there's a bunch of broader implications of this project. For those of you who are social scientists in the room, very famously, we learned that the state makes war and war makes the state. This is a Charles Tilly argument. This is the birth of the European state, comes out of all of this warfare that they have with other states. And over time, they develop all of the institutions that we see around us. In a similar vein, you can think about gangs making war and war making gangs. They have to develop a larger organization, a more coercive apparatus to try to govern territory when they're competing with other groups. But that doesn't quite explain all of their behavior. As I mentioned, their benevolent activities are more about trying to avoid enforcement. So people have used this state formation argument to try to apply to criminal or criminalized groups. And I think there are some specifics that comparison is missing. There's also, as Desmond is working on projects in this vein, and we have a lot of colleagues who are doing this, people have been trying to marry or bring together the literatures about rebel governance, how different insurgent or terrorist organizations govern populations, and how a variety of criminalized groups or extra legal groups are also governing. I think this project has implications in that we can see how local security environments are dictating a certain set of activities that I think maps on quite well to how other types of organizations, despite the fact that the gangs don't have a political ideology, they're not trying to take over the state, they don't want anything to do with the state really. They want to make their money, and they want to remain free from enforcement. Nonetheless, a lot of their behaviors map very closely onto how other more politically motivated groups are behaving. And then finally, when it comes to policy, crackdowns by police are over time, I've become more and more convinced that they're entirely counterproductive. They don't actually threaten these groups in any way. They forge closer relationships between communities and these organizations. I think policy should focus much more on reducing inter-gang or inter-criminal violence to try to bring down these levels of coercion that these groups use in these neighborhoods. And from there, we can try to develop an alternative set of policies that try to bring some of these gang members back into the community to the point where they don't feel like they need to walk around with AK-47s and semi-automatic rifles to feel safe in their neighborhoods. So I'll leave it there. I think I talked for about 45, maybe a little bit over, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you have about the project. Thank you.
So thank you for your interesting talk, Nick. Why don't we take some questions? It'd be great to get a couple questions at a time. And if you could just say your name, your affiliation, please go ahead. Yes. You? No, I'm putting it you. Yeah.
And now we are gangs.
Yes.
My question has always been the relationship between the knowledge of the gangs in offense particularly and their relationships to class level.
Yeah.
Because those tend to be marginalized segment of the population and the school level. Now, they have been used also by the state, particularly when the state, like in the case of an absence of, so what the government has been doing was to remove those gangs and integrate them in the police. So that's one thing. The other division has to do with accumulation, capital accumulation. What is the always stop that we can have? And you organize because they don't have the skill to manage the type of money that they are receiving. So someone, the drug party, more used to capital right now, always those are the situations that are always about the so again, experience social mobility. Controls of the soul that they get now. And what type of sites were needs to get the lot of not government, but very sort of kidnap. And they kidnap the social people. And we don't know the money that they say they are asking is inflated. And also the people that are paying them are also inflated, are also inflating. So I think I will stop here. The other thing that I want to say is that in Haiti, maybe you know that organization in Brazil, Rio, that was came to Haiti with all in relations with police. And I doubt that this problem has been solved. But there was the second most important organization coming from Brazil. And then they began to plan with it. And for the pacification with people, but also with collecting or pacification sense. So
Thank you for those questions and comments. A very interesting set. Should I address them immediately and then just go one at a time?
I think we have time to take them.
Okay, great. There's a lot here. Yes, so the origins of the gangs is something that I address in the book as well. And they have various types of origins. Some of them are local men, young men usually, who were some of them were in bands, others of them were engaging in sort of illicit or informal activities. Others were bank robbers and were engaging in assaults and kidnappings of the variety that you describe. But over time, these different groups sort of evolve in a similar way and then feed up into what these prison-based factions. And then it becomes much more systematized. The organizational structure of all the organizations looks relatively similar across the city. And the type of capital that they can accumulate is significant indeed. So in the Terceiro Comando set of neighborhoods, we're talking about 5 million reais a month. So over time, we're talking huge amounts of resources. A lot of that goes into the salaries of hundreds of gang members. They also have to distribute benefits to the local neighborhood. They throw parties. At least that gang pays bribes to the police that cost them about a quarter of their income. I talk about the finances of the gangs as well and how it varies, but the resources that they're bringing in are significant indeed. At the lowest levels of the gang, they're not getting paid very much. The lookouts, the most expendable members are making a few hundred reais a week. Now that's better than minimum wage, but they're not really experiencing social mobility in this way. The only members that really experience social mobility are the leaders of the organization, but they're so sought after by the police that they really have very little freedom. Some of them can travel for a while, but most of them end up getting caught and put in prison or killed. The average life of a gang member is a little over 2 years. So despite the fact that they can make money maybe in the short term, many of them are dying relatively quickly or end up in prison often quite quickly. So this is not a form of social mobility, but it's a difficult choice for an 11 or 12-year-old to make who doesn't like school, has a difficult family life perhaps, and wants access to clothes and a motorcycle and wants to impress his friends and the girls in the community. Most of them are men. There are some women in the organization that are often used as mules. I interviewed some of them as well, and I'm happy to talk about that. But this is the general experience and the sort of political economy of it. This is not a way for these individuals to become wealthy or, accumulate capital in the long term. This is a set of activities and practices that they engage in out of precarity. And once you enter in the gang, your life gets both short in terms of time, but as well, most of the gang members never can leave the community. So some of them have never left a quarter of a square mile. And so, these are difficult lives that they lead, and they're engaging in a lot of also coercive and illegal activities. But I think it's important to understand the experiences of members who get caught up in these organizations. These are not inherently benevolent organizations. They engage in some of these benevolent activities to gain the support of the community because they're afraid. As far as Viva Rio and Haiti are concerned, Rio de Janeiro had one of the largest, most famous community policing programs or attempts at community policing that maybe emerged from a set of conversations that Viva Rio was involved in terms of, repairing the relations between police and local communities. That has almost totally gone away in Rio de Janeiro. If people have paid attention, the pacification program is basically dead, and the police have returned to a much more repressive, much more violent set of practices. How you can repair those relations, given that the very institution of the police was created to control favela communities, to control former slave populations. It was built to do that. How you can reform an institution like that, especially following the dictatorship. They've never reformed the police following the dictatorship in the 80s, is a huge task, and I'm not sure there's the political or social will for it. So my sense is that perhaps similar to Haiti, we're going to be caught in this sort of cycle for quite some time. And this is what late modern capitalism looks like in some places. But thank you so much for the comments, and I'd be happy to talk more about Haiti. I know a little, but there's a lot going on there at the moment that I'd be interested to hear about. Thank you.
you both want have two questions. First is nature of groups and second is presence of intent only the group of group. So the first one is what is the potential difference in terms of governance in the gangs and other criminal groups? And second, according to some political indicators, gangs are moving from Rio to other parts of Brazil in rural areas, particularly in the after the valley. So I want to ask you if you have identified if these gangs are building connections to other gangs or other actors in that part of the country. I'm curious to know if you know what's the logic of this territorial presence in other places.
Great, thank you. Excuse me. Versus other criminal groups, the type of governance that they engage in. Well, I mean, it really depends on which criminal groups you're talking about. So in Rio, you could compare the gangs to the militias, or these are police connected sort of mafia style organizations. But these and Desmond and I have written about this comparison and tried to think about what creates militia territories and how what governance looks like in those neighborhoods versus gang controlled ones. The difference couldn't be more stark. In militia neighborhoods, you will almost never see anyone carrying weapons around. They have little fear of the police coming into those neighborhoods. Most of them are police, former or current in many cases. So, and the gangs have not built a political apparatus, whereas the militias have worked themselves into political parties. They've worked themselves to the highest levels of government. Even the former president Jair Bolsonaro and his sons had certain connections with militias in the city. Gangs are not capable of engaging in that type of behavior. They have very weak connections with political parties. They're highly criminalized individuals from these neighborhoods. Most of them are young black men, Afro-Brazilian men that are criminalized by both the state and society, and they're not capable of developing strong political relationships. They exist within a totally different universe than other criminal groups. And that's why I started using this term criminalized governance, because it really gets at this difference between militias that are, although we might call them criminal organizations, they're not criminalized by the state. They're sort of connected to the state. They're integrated into it. At certain moments, the state has tried to criminalize them, but in a totally different capacity, in a different way than the state criminalizes these drug trafficking gangs. So I think that this is a really interesting conversation to have about types of criminal groups, how they relate to other types of organizations, and what that means for governance. In terms of presence, absolutely. Comando Vermelho has spread throughout most of the states in Brazil through the prison system. This was a strategy that the state developed to try to remove the leaders of the organizations and send them to different places to try to weaken the organization somehow. But this has just spread the groups to all of these different places. I like to think you might think of it like some sort of overarching organization, but really it's a social technology of how to organize themselves within prisons, how to connect themselves to local communities, mostly marginalized and impoverished ones, throughout all of the urban spaces within Brazil, of which there are many. And it's not a cohesive organization. It's a relatively decentralized set of relationships between these groups and neighborhood level gangs. It's much better understood like that than some sort of hierarchical organization led by a few people at the very top, although they do have a leadership of sorts. So yeah, and the PCC from Sao Paulo has been doing a similar thing. They have a very different internal governance structure that I think is even more interesting in some ways, more democratic. more bureaucratic, that looks quite different from CV. But these types of relationships between gangs exist in most of Latin America. The more you put these types of individuals from particular neighborhoods who have an understanding as to how gangs work, you put more of them in prison. These are just opportunities for them to communicate with each other and further develop their organizations and this social technology. You find that in the United States. You find that in many, many places throughout the world. So yeah, I mean, and at least the politics in Brazil, there's very few people who are saying that we should get rid of prisons and imprison fewer people. Even people on the left are advocating for better conditions within prisons, building more prisons. Brazil 20 years ago had 50 prisons. Today they have 1,500. This is not going to be a problem that is going to go away. These groups are going to expand to all of these different places, at least as far as I'm concerned. And there aren't a lot of people advocating for alternative policies with this understanding. So I don't know where we go from here necessarily, but the spread is definitely happening. It's even happening to other countries in Latin America, which is, I think, an interesting phenomenon once you get criminal organizations that are present in multiple different countries.
So I just wanted to follow up on that question. So do you see that the militias is just not fitting within your rubric, like the framework that you've built here? Like, are they just like not on there? Like, because they're just different, that they're not criminalized governance, they're paramilitarized governance or something different?
I would say that you could use we'll see what happens with the militias moving forward. What we've seen over the last couple of years is actually they're developing relationships with drug trafficking gangs. They're starting to engage in drug trafficking. There may be some changes occurring within that militia space where some of those organizations become much more criminalized, in which case their security environments would possibly look a lot more like what I'm talking about here. I think thinking about the two dynamics of relationships with rivals, and we've talked about this before, militias don't really fight wars with each other, or they might be very quiet wars where they go and they try to assassinate a leader or get rid of someone, but they're not fighting the same type of territorial, like almost insurgency style battles with each other. So I think that looks quite distinct. And part of the reason for that is that they are incorporated into the state, and through the state, they can resolve a lot of their disputes and problems. Whereas all of these organizations are totally pushed out of the state. There's no, other than if it's happening on like sort of a local illicit way where maybe police are trying to mediate disputes, but in fact, police incentivize a lot of the confrontations and competition between the groups because it makes their protection worth so much more money when these groups feel insecure. So I just think that the militias live in a totally different universe. I think the same framework, thinking about the militias' relationship to each other and with the state, could be useful for understanding how they govern. But they have also a variety of political attitudes. They want to develop political parties. They have a very different set of capacities as well, being maybe from the same neighborhoods, but they're trained. Many of them are educated. They have long careers in the police department. So these are I think they're just very different types of organizations. I like thinking about, comparing them, but this work here focuses much more just on gangs and how they're criminalized and how that creates a specific environment in which they're thinking about strategically how they can survive. I don't see militias necessarily going through the same set of calculations.
In back, state your name and.
Oh, nice. Oh. I arrived in Rio in 2012 and I left in 2015.
people, and so it's
Mhm.
part of the city's growth, like cognition, in fact, cognition was kind of just a small
Mhm.
but now people and the thing from the president, and now it became the most powerful parallel in which I would like to hear about the second time. What is the
Hmm.
those time? Third one.
Hmm.
But now place very much by any states of the flag so that second time now that's about the Bible, the right thing, I'd like to hear about the second time.
Hmm. Thanks. We have time?
There's a
Okay.
bunch of other questions.
Okay, great. If people are happy. Pacification. So Mare experienced pacification different than all of the other pacifications in Rio. It never received the police units that it was supposedly promised. Instead, the Brazilian military stepped in, occupied it, 2,500 Marine and Army soldiers stationed on the streets 24 hours a day for 15 months. This began in early April of 2014. And stayed through June, July of the following year. I lived in Mare when that happened and then lived under pacification, what we can call pacification, even though it was quite different. So the gangs no longer could maintain their ostensive control of the streets. This is part of the book as well. They were sort of reduced to adolescents selling drugs in alleyways and sort of being mobile. They were still present in those neighborhoods, and there was a lot of violence that was going on in one of the neighborhoods. And I used this theory to try to analyze why the gangs became violent even against the military. They were one of the gangs, the Terceiro Comando, was attacking the military. And this is because another rival, the rival that they had pushed out, the Amigos dos Amigos in 2009, used pacification as an opportunity to try to come back in and take back those neighborhoods because all of these men were from those neighborhoods. A couple of them still had connections and family there. And so these two gangs were fighting even in the midst of military occupation. I think this demonstrates, one, the fact that the state is really incapable of eradicating, no matter how much force they put on the street. There's so little faith of these communities in the public security apparatus. It's more for the military. They have less distrust of the military. They don't have a history of corruption, but the state is unable to really govern in the way that many of the gangs do. So, then the military responds by engaging in human rights abuses, using more repressive violence, and this exacerbates the lack of governance, the governance vacuum, basically. So I describe all of this in the book. So I think pacification, when we talk about community policing, that happened in a few of the neighborhoods, I think. But as the project expanded into the Zona Norte and in Mare, you never even had police in the neighborhoods through pacification. It looks wildly different as it expanded really radically ahead of the World Cup and the Olympic Games. In terms of militias and their growth, the militias control as much territory and population in Rio as Comando Vermelho, and that definitely didn't used to be the case. As I said, these are even in some ways more insidious organizations that can use much higher levels of impunity because they're connected politically, they're connected to the police, and the police are not actively enforcing against the vast majority of them. So I don't see that ending anytime soon, unless you get a very different set of political institutions and governance dynamics at the highest level. But I would suspect that they'll keep growing in that way. CV is not going to go away. It's even, it's much more populous in the Baixada, in Niterói, in São Gonçalo. It's all throughout all the other states. So CV, even though if they lose a bunch of territory in Rio, it's not a huge problem for the organization. I would say it's going to be difficult for the militias to take over places like Nova Holanda. The connections between the community and those organizations are deep and multiple, and they're very densely populated. Militias would require a massive group of militia members to try to come in and even attempt to take over those. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. And then in terms of the connections between the gangs and the churches, the evangelical movement has been very strong in Rio's favelas for the last several decades. We've seen connections between gang members and churches. Even the gangs that I study have connections with churches in the local neighborhood, and use some religious rhetoric. They may even target certain populations, Afro-Brazilian, religious practices, might be people who practice them might be punished in certain neighborhoods. I think of these connections as kind of weak still. I don't see the gang members as necessarily motivated by religion or ideological in that way, even though they do use some of that rhetoric. But they've been doing that for a long time. It would be interesting to see a more overtly religious Comando Vermelho, although people have described the group as somewhat religious for a long time in terms of the symbols that they use, the type of affection that members have for the organization and its history. But yeah, those are excellent questions. Thank you.
If you could tell us who you are.
Teresa Mead, and it was very interesting. Could you talk a bit about the mediation of disputes? How that takes place? You said it's domestic violence, sexual crimes, or I don't know what else there is. Property, neighborhood sorts of things.
Yep.
Did you do this? How would someone bring a dispute? I couldn't think of bringing a domestic issue to, a young man who,
yeah.
Mediate.
Yeah. I think it's a really fascinating set of questions to think about how and why they're mediating disputes, who avails themselves of these services. So generally, these types of problems, because people in the community don't have access to the public security apparatus, you can't go to the police. It's strictly forbidden to go to the police to report crimes of any sort. So the gang, in a sense, offers this service as a replacement. So if you have a problem with your neighbor, for instance, you get into a fight about something having to do with your house, or you have a situation of domestic violence or child abuse, these sorts of things. But there's a lot more types of arguments that can emerge between a business owner and employees. It could have to do with a landlord and tenants. In many cases, if they can't figure out a way to solve it amongst themselves or using other means, there are some other organizations that offer dispute resolution services, not formally, but certain churches will try to mediate disputes. Certain NGOs engage in that behavior as well. But many people, the buck stops at the gang because they're the ones who can use violence or the threat of violence to resolve a dispute. And in some cases, that's what it takes. And so the resident will, they say, go to the boca. So you would go to the place where the gang members hang out, or you would use your networks. Many people in these neighborhoods have a distant relative or a relative who's in the gang or formerly in the gang, and they may ask them to contact someone in the gang, maybe a higher up, to resolve a dispute for them. How the gang resolves the dispute, depends on the gang, for one, depends on the issue, depends on who the members are. Desmond has written very excellent articles about this, like who gets access to these services, who the gang protects within the neighborhood. It's a very political process that the gang has to go through. But they'll sometimes resolve it violently if they feel like they need to, especially regarding sexual violence. They often punish very violently for those sorts of crimes. Other things, they'll deal with domestic abuse, like tell basically the husband or the abuser to not return. If the woman welcomes him back, eventually the gang may wash their hands of the issue and say, this is your problem now, we resolved it once. So it really depends on the type of problem. But there is, and it's not everyone within the community that uses this service, but many people, especially the most marginalized within the community who don't have access to other means of resolving problems, will eventually use the gang to resolve a dispute. And even people who may do everything that they can to avoid any interactions with gangs may find themselves requiring their services. If something gets stolen from them, or a car gets stolen, or something that gets damaged on their house, they may have to go to speak to the gang to have that problem resolved, even if they don't necessarily want to. Otherwise, they'll just have to let it go. And those are the sorts of difficult decisions that residents are having to make within these neighborhoods because they basically have no access to the criminal justice system. Thanks.
Couple of questions. First one is about the method. It's about that 17 gang members, correct?
Sorry?
17 interviews with gang members.
Yeah.
Was that interviews with both and if it was, how famous is that to the two complete factions in the community in which you're living as trying to research? And another one is talking about the militias. I mean, there has been, I'm hearing that potentially there's this new connection between the militias and the number of communities. And there has been this expansion of violence in kind of Plaza Cerca, Galera Azul, where this violence is starting to increase, and the militias do seem to be becoming, maybe at least at a frontal level, less connected to the police, and seem to be emerging as just a new national police. And I'd be interested to hear your view on that. And then finally, with regards to the benevolent dictator and benevolence of the gangs, how kind of common do you think that is? Because I know you referenced the Bali Fund, but isn't the Bali Fund just a way in which the drug gangs make lots of money for the community and also promote their own culture in the community and the acceptance of their own kind of this is how things should be done? So be interested to kind of hear your comments on that as well.
Great. So the first one about methods. Yes, I interviewed members of all three gang organizations. I started in Nova Yolanda. It took me I decided that I was going to wait a long time to start interviewing current gang members. So I started by mostly interviewing residents, people who were willing to talk about the topic. And then through my expanding social networks, I started to get access to former gang members, mostly men who had left the organization, but still remained in the community and were willing to talk to me about it. And then only then later on, after about 5 or 6 months, did I start interviewing current gang members. So it took a long time for me to feel comfortable doing that, as well as I felt like I needed to be there for a while for the community to feel comfortable with my presence and show them that I was sticking around. I wasn't going to come in and leave, or I wasn't talking to the police, or any of these sorts of doubts that I know can emerge within these types of neighborhoods. As far as the TCP members, I got access to them during the period of occupation by the military. There were about 50 members of both CV and TCP, 25 each roughly, who left the organizations and entered into an NGO program that helped them to try to leave the life. And so I worked with the NGO and I would do interviews with them and I would accompany them through therapy sessions and through classes that they were taking to get the equivalent of a GED, right? Sort of basic high school education diplomas. And as they were trying to get jobs in the formal sector. So I got access to a lot of TCP members, even very high up members within the organization through that mechanism. And that was just a product of me like spending a lot of time there and being there at the right time. I don't think I would have probably started interviewing current members. You have to be very careful about crossing over boundaries, and especially if those two groups are rivals, have been rivals for several decades. But during that period of occupation, I felt like pretty secure to do all of that work. So that was just kind of felicitous. The narco militias, I mean, this is something that I just mentioned when I was talking about, the militias historically being in a very different space, but there are reports where these groups are starting to engage in drug trafficking and maybe having a slightly different relationship to the state. And I think you're absolutely right that would be a very bad thing, I think, not that right now it's great, but the further development of narco militias, it would increase the violence across the city quite a lot, I think. But I do see that happening. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that in the future. Just because there's so much money to be made off of drug trafficking of this variety. And then with the baile funks, you're absolutely right that the gangs are making a lot of money off of the baile funks. They're using it to spread their culture, so to speak. They're using it as an opportunity to recruit. But there is something about providing parties like that free of charge. It's a cultural event in the community, and it is very much seen as a benefit, especially to young people. In addition, the gangs offer a lot of families the opportunity to sell food and drink at these parties. So you'll find dozens of little huts that the gang helps organize, and these families can make a lot of money at the parties. So that also serves as a benefit to the community. And then the bailes are happening every week or very frequently, but there's a variety of other parties that the gangs are throwing. When they have birthday parties, they'll invite everybody on their street, they'll hand out gifts, they'll free food, free drink, and especially for communities that lack a lot of free entertainment. This isn't like the Zona Sul where they can just leave and go to maybe free beach or public parties that exist in those spaces. It comes at a premium. And I think that the communities very much see that as a benefit. Yeah. Yeah. I don't see the baile funks as a negative by any means. I mean it is a cultural expression that arises out of communities of poverty and marginalization in the same way that samba or hip hop or other global phenomena. And you can see how popular baile funk is. Funk music is not just in Rio, but throughout a lot of the world. And now it's becoming much more mainstream. So I see it as a cultural practice that the gangs develop and use to their advantage, but they're promoting local artists. They're promoting, cultural festivities. I remember even watching on Instagram, some musicians from favelas talking about how, the state isn't promoting local music in these communities. It's the drug traffickers that are responsible for the development of local art in not every aspect, but for, not a small number of musicians and artists. Even so, I, as Desmond mentioned in the introduction, I work with local photographers and filmmakers in Mare, and we put together art exhibits that are traveling around. At the moment, it's in Scotland. And one of the groups has made a wonderful, very fascinating documentary about drag shows that were being put on in Mare in the 1980s. that the gang understood how popular these parties were and then started promoting them, right? A drag show promoted by a local gang. So you can see how the gangs will use local artistic practices, promote them. I mean, I know people who show movies on the streets and they will ask the gangs if they will, you know, help them promote it or use their sound equipment, and they'll do that. So, you know, I think these are much more important than maybe people recognize or just see the baile funks as like a very cynical way for gangs to make money. But I think they're much more powerful than that in terms of like instilling their culture in a whole new generation of young people who love them as places to go and have fun and they can express themselves. But, you know, the bailes are just one part of it. In Mare, the bailes have expanded really exponentially. Now they're producing them. One of them is called the Baile de Disney. So the Disney baile. And they have a massive multicolored tent that they put up over an entire square. It's very, very well produced. They're spending a lot of money to do it. Yes, they make a lot of money off of the drug trade, but people love these parties, like love them. They'll come from all over the city to attend some of these parties. So I wouldn't diminish the value of the baile culturally for a lot of these neighborhoods.
Political science makes it retired from here in other college. This is such a rich, interesting topic. We have a couple of questions to bring up. First, quick one: when's the book going to be read? Next one.
Tough one. No. So I've got reviews back. I'm finishing it up now. I'll send it off this month. So hopefully within the next year.
Good. You gave that great vignette of being there for the shootout and the grenades and everything else. And you didn't mention police until the end when you got home, and then you heard the helicopters. That was an hour shootout, at least as you described it. Do the police just lie low until the bullets are not flying, or do they come in to do something about it? That's one question. Related to that, you've kind of given us an ethnography of these organizations. What about ordinary people? What is life like when I look at this photo that you've got here, which looks like kind of a nice place near rooftop picnic places on people's houses, things like that. So what is life like for ordinary people? Because I'm assuming there are lots of ordinary people who are not gang members. Do they pay tribute or something to the gang?
Great questions. So how do the police react to gang shootouts and confrontations? So in some cases, the police can organize themselves and get there in the midst of the confrontation. But I would say most often it's difficult for them to get all of their caveirões, the helicopter, and get there while the actual confrontation is happening. The building of, so within these neighborhoods, I can, let's see if I can show you. So the fact that they built a military police battalion in these neighborhoods, they built it in 2003 here. There. So this is the 22nd Military Police Battalion. So they built that in 2003 because the gangs here had been fighting several years of war. And what that eventually ended up meaning is that the warfare would spill out into these highways that surround Mare, and it would bring the entire northern zone of the city to a standstill because no cars would be moving on those highways. So the city decided to put this battalion inside a favela. It's the only favela in the entire city where there's a police installation of this size, as an attempt to be able to get there much more quickly when the gangs were actually at war. So it's often the case that the gangs will engage in a shootout and then the police will be there quickly thereafter, which is why, you know, when we were walking back, there was nobody on the streets because everyone knew that the police were coming. And that's a relationship that I don't talk about here in this presentation, but the warfare between the gangs is very closely related to the police enforcement that happens. So these relationships are shifting back and forth. Gang warfare can produce a lot more police enforcement, but police enforcement can also produce gang warfare. In that when the police crack down on one group and weaken them, another group may see that as an opportunity to try to attack and take more territory. So these types of this relationship between inner gang warfare and police enforcement is much closer than I sort of lead on in the presentation. But in the book, I deal with this at length by describing the ways that they sort of feed into one another. But this is a very important question. In general, though, I don't see the police as wanting to necessarily reduce the amount of warfare between the gangs. In some of the interviews I do that I've done with police, they actually think that the warfare between the gangs is good because more gang members are going to die, and it kind of makes their job easier in some sense, that they have to, do less work to try to kill gang members or enforce against them. I think that if in the ideal world, the police would mediate or try to prevent warfare between the gangs much more actively, to try to reduce the amount of coercive capacity that these groups feel that they need. They're not getting grenades and really high-powered rifles to confront the state necessarily. They're doing that to confront each other. And I think that if we actually understood that was the reason that they're gathering up this military capacity, instead of saying that these groups are trying to take over the state or they want to rule Rio de Janeiro. Even a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if people saw on Fantástico, there was a huge expose of some of the gangs in Maré. And you had a bunch of public security officials saying basically like these groups are trying to, this is a problem for the state because they're trying to take over. And this, I think, totally misunderstands why these groups are behaving in these ways. That's not to say that they like the police or they don't occasionally confront them, but it's not to take over the state. They're not doing it for those reasons, despite the fact that politicians might use this rhetoric. As far as ordinary people go, there's 140,000 people who live in Maré. I would say about 1,000 of them are gang members. A lot, maybe 15% of the population maintains relationships with the gang in some way through friendship networks, social networks, familial relations. But then most of the people are just trying to live their lives. They try to avoid the gangs when and where they can. They try not to rely on the gangs. They refuse to accept any benefits that the gangs provide. And they live their life much like anyone else. They go to work. They send their kids to school. They have parties at their houses. They do all of the things that everyone else does. And they don't necessarily have to have a very close relationship with the gang. But they can suffer from gang shootouts. The schools are closed. They can get caught in these circumstances. They can't go to work. So they're experiencing a lot of the negative externalities of gang governance, even if they are able to avoid it otherwise. I mean, I think these are an important set of questions that I'm hoping to address in a subsequent project where I focus much more on the resident side of this story. Thank you.
Okay. Philip looks like he's losing his shyness. So like last question.
Philip's not shy.
I'm curious more about like the embeddedness or brokenness gang. Seems like at the state they're much more often going to vote and sticky with the fact. It's not like when they're competing with each other, they can almost be watched in, walked out, like floating in there, but not very loose.
Yeah.
So how embedded are they? The gang members uses, gang faction uses their term, and it becomes seems like it'd be very hard to conquer. Place you're not.
Yeah. It's very hard. So Yes, I would say almost all gangs throughout the city are embedded within the neighborhoods. It's going to vary depending on the neighborhood. A gang that's at war with a rival is probably going to have a harder time being really deeply embedded in the neighborhood. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is they often receive people from the outside who come in who don't have any local connections. They're just there to sort of reinforce the gang and its presence in the territory. But as well, people are probably less willing to go to the gang, to use the gang to resolve disputes when the gang is actively at war and behaving in a more coercive manner. So the impact of that activation of a rival threat is really disastrous for the relationship with the local community, which is why it becomes so much more coercive and people are so much more afraid of the gang in those moments. Taking over new territory, I talked to a lot of gang members who were part of gangs that had won territory, and developing connections on a local level is a relatively systematized process that they've learned over the history of these organizations. So generally what they do is they take young, unaffiliated men from the neighborhood and try to incorporate them immediately into their networks, right? Use them for information about the local neighborhood. They want to know who was connected before, who had friends, and then they're going to systematically go throughout that neighborhood and expel almost all of the men who had any relationship with the gang. And then they've told me that it depends on what the women will say in terms of whether or not they're going to expel them. But this is why you find when you get a gang that takes over a new territory, there is a sort of refugee process where families will pick up everything and leave precisely for this reason. Many of those who are closely connected will leave of their own accord. They don't even wait around for the gang to come around and knock on their door. They'll just leave immediately. But, you know, over time, especially the gangs that I talked to who took over new territory, they're going to behave in a much more benevolent fashion immediately to try to gain the support of the local community because they understand how important that is. But it's often the case that these gang members who are expelled are eventually going to try to come back. They will often be expelled and they'll have to go and find other neighborhoods where they have a faction affiliation to try to survive. But they are in a lot of trouble when you're part of a gang that's been expelled from its territory. Basically, gangs without territory do not exist. Uh, oh. I've heard this, yes. Yeah. 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 I mean, I think there's some interesting comparisons that we can make there. I mean, one, the Brazilian state is, and I heard this from a lot of the military soldiers who eventually were in Maré because they were stationed in Haiti as part of MINUSTA, the Pacific, the peacekeeping force, UN peacekeeping force. And they said, this is a very different context. The Brazilian state is much more capable, much stronger. And so gangs, even if they do engage in some activities outside of those borders, are not making large incursions into middle-class neighborhoods. I don't want to speak about Haiti because I don't know enough to speak well about it. But if and when they do that sort of thing, the police are very attentive to that. If, however, the legitimacy of the Rio de Janeiro government with, you know, those middle-class neighborhoods and the relationship with the police deteriorates so dramatically, that could create opportunities for gangs to move beyond favelas into other types of neighborhoods. And in other areas of the city, this is not the case in Mare, but where the distinction, like in the Zona Oeste, which is like the newest area of Rio de Janeiro, where the distinction between favela and formal city is a little harder to see. The territories might, you know, spread out beyond those boundaries. But in areas like the Zona Norte, where you know very clearly where the favelas are and where the asfalt, this is how they refer to the formal city, those boundaries are often much clearer because these are much older favelas that emerged in the middle or the first half of the 20th century. And so the formal city surrounds them almost entirely. And the police make sure that those gang members are sort of in there. So in Mare, along all of these highways, you'll constantly see police cars. They're there all 24 hours of the day, making sure that the gangs aren't moving outside of those borders or make it very difficult for them to do so. But I think this is a very interesting question, is how these groups can move and gobble up new territory. In another context, like say in Chicago, you know, there aren't favelas, they're just sort of more or less marginalized or impoverished neighborhoods, and gang boundaries can grow a block or move in much more interesting ways. Whereas Rio, these are sort of islands in the city. And so the particular geography of the city makes it look a certain way. But the urban infrastructure, how the relationship of police to local neighborhoods is going to dictate what territorial control actually looks like, what types of neighborhoods, the types of governance activities that are needed or demanded within any community. But these are a fascinating set of discussions when we think about comparing across different countries or different urban spaces.
So I'd like to thank Nicholas for his talk and thank everybody for coming.
Thank you.
And please join us next week for Joe Marie Burt's presentation on human rights in Guatemala.